Good morning. Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted this morning to be with Professor Turner and Professor Massimo, both distinguished scholars who are going to be having an interesting dialogue about neo-Darwinism and the third way of evolution. I've had both of them on my channel recently, so the viewers watching this would know who they are. Massimo is distinguished in having a philosophy of biology background as well as a biology background, and Scott Turner is a distinguished scientist who's been quite prominent in the third way of evolution. So I'm going to give up the discussion to these guys in terms of these two paradigms. But to begin off with, Professor Scott, if you can explain what the third way of evolution is, please.
Thanks, Sabur, and very pleased to be on the screen with you, Massimo. The third way of evolution is an eclectic group of scientists and philosophers, and they're united by a couple of ideas. First is the inadequacy of the modern synthesis, and we'll be talking about that in more depth, I'm sure, to explain problems of evolution. And the contrast to that, of course, is the extended evolutionary synthesis, of which Massimo has written eloquently on quite a bit. And the third way group of people are they have in common a belief that, well, even the extended evolutionary synthesis has its shortcomings, and that there has to be a different way of looking at it. You can think about the third way of evolution in a different way. One of the very prominent public criticisms of Darwinism has, of course, come from the intelligent design theory movement. And my opinion there is that the public discourse about and scientific discourse about evolution is divided between two very radically different camps that don't really speak to one another very much. They don't have a common language, and that's intelligent design versus Darwinism, broadly defined. And the third way actually tries to skirt a path between those two to try to reclaim a kind of intellectual no man's land in the public sphere about our public discussions about evolution. And evolution is not just a scientific issue; it's a very deep cultural issue, and we should be having public conversations about that. And the modern state of evolutionary science, I don't think covers that no man's land adequately. And so that's one of the things that is behind the third way of evolution. And one final way of distinguishing them is that I think the third way of evolution, people tend to look more, take a more functional perspective on this. And of course, this is where Dennis Noble comes in, who is a physiologist. He's interested in how living things work, and he's trying to bring a perspective, a physiological perspective, to evolutionary thought that expands upon really what is a gene-centric approach to evolution, which characterizes the modern synthesis.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Professor Scott. Professor Massimo, maybe we can distinguish out a few terms. So often academics are using neo-Darwinism and modern synthesis in an interchangeable way, but obviously they are different. And some people may not have heard of the extended evolutionary synthesis. So if you can explain these terms, please.
Yeah, actually, at a first approximation, neo-Darwinism is the modern synthesis. There is a technical, historical difference there, but let's not get into it because it's irrelevant to what we're discussing here. Basically, the modern synthesis happened in several stages, and the first stage which happened at the end of the 19th century, is technically referred to as neo-Darwinism. I think what we need to understand here is what it is that we're talking about at a more basic level. That is, what is Darwinism? Before we even get into the third way, the extended synthesis or anything else, it's probably better to clarify what Darwinism is. So Darwinism marks, with the publication of a joint paper in front of the Linnean Society in 1858 by Darwin and Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection, and then eventually the following year in 1859 with the publication of The Origin of Species by Darwin. That marks the beginning of evolutionary biology as a science. Before that, there simply was no evolutionary biology. The concept of evolution itself, or change over time, is very old. It actually goes back to the pre-Socratics. But as a science, as a scientific approach to explaining the diversity and the history of life, essentially begins in the middle of the 19th century with Darwin and Wallace. And it was, in fact, Scott mentioned intelligent design. It was, in fact, in part, a reaction against the dominant paradigm of the time, if we want to use that word, which was intelligent design, natural theology, which was based on intelligent design. Darwin himself, in The Origin of Species, devotes a chapter to respond to William Paley, who, in the early part of the 19th century, had famously come up with this metaphor that, if you walk on the beach and you see a watch, you immediately think that there was a watchmaker, and you start asking questions about who made the watch and whatnot. Why? Well, because it's a complex, obviously functional object, and therefore, since it has a function, it has a purpose. Therefore, somebody must have designed it, right? And the design argument itself was certainly not new with Paley. That also goes back all the way to ancient Greece. Plato arguably is one of the first ones to propose a version of intelligent design, and the Stoics did as well. So the fundamental new ideas of Darwin are two. As I say, he didn't invent the concept of evolution. These have been around for a while. In fact, his grandfather, Erasmus, had talked about evolution, had written about evolution. What he suggested was that there are two fundamental ideas at the base of what we today call theory of evolution. One, common descent. All organisms on Earth are derived by either one or a very small number of common ancestors, way back, essentially at the beginning of the origin of life. And two, natural selection. Natural selection is the process that explains, according to Darwin, the diversity and especially the function of the functionality of life. That is, the fact that living organisms, unlike inert matter, unlike rocks and mountains and things like that, they appear to have been designed. They appear to have a function. And this appearance of design is explained by the process of natural selection. At the time Darwin wrote all of this, there was a third component that was missing. And Darwin was aware of it, and that was inheritance. It's like, yeah, okay, but how is this process of natural selection actually work? It favors new variation that is adaptive, that is good for the organism, that is functional for the organism. But where does that variation come from, and how is it inherited from one generation to another? Darwin was aware that this was an issue. He proposed his own theory of inheritance, referred to as blended inheritance, which turned out he immediately recognized wasn't going to work. He flirted a little bit with Lamarckism, the notion that the characteristics that are altered during the lifetime of an organism can be inherited, and then eventually that also was dropped pretty soon. But we get to the end of the 19th century with Darwinism essentially now being the new paradigm, the new reference frame, but still missing a theory of heredity. Unbeknownst to Darwin, there was a theory of heredity that had been proposed by Gregor Mendel, but Mendel made a couple of classic mistakes in academic careers, which is why his work was ignored until the turn of the 20th century. Number one, he published in an obscure journal that nobody read. And number two, he eventually went into what we would today call administration. He became an administrator. So his academic career stopped. His research career stopped. And so people ignored him until the rediscovery of his work in the beginning of the 20th century. That's the beginning of modern genetics. With 1900, the rediscovery of Mendel's work. This created a crisis in Darwinism because it looked initially like the discoveries of modern genetics were antithetical to Darwinism. Darwin was talking about slow, gradual change over time. The new geneticists discovered mutations. Mutations seemed to be instantaneous, and it seemed to be discrete. Things where characters were either yellow or green in the color of the pods of bean pods, or at any rate, they seem to be discrete. That seemed to be a problem. That generated the first impetus for what became the modern synthesis. Basically, the modern synthesis is a broader framework that expands on the original Darwinism, reconciles Darwinism with the new genetics. The modern synthesis started in the 1920s. It was completed by the 1940s, and it essentially brought together not only the original Darwinism, but paleontology, botany, zoology, natural history, and especially genetics. Crucially, one of the things that was left out of the modern synthesis was developmental biology, for a number of reasons, again, that it's probably not important to get into it at this point, but developmental biologists were there. They were doing a lot of interesting work, but that work was not incorporated. It was not a conceptual framework to incorporate in the modern synthesis. The modern synthesis became it still is the point of reference in evolutionary biology until the 1980s, early 90s, when people like myself started making noises to the effect that, it's time to bring in developmental biology. It's time, in fact, to bring in a number of other both approaches and discoveries that biologists have made in the meantime. And we started proposing what today is known as the extended synthesis. By the very name, one can tell that the idea is not to replace the modern synthesis, but to expand it, right? So we don't think that there is anything wrong with the fundamental Darwinism. We think that the principle of common descent is correct. We do think that natural selection is either the only or the primary explanation for adaptation in the biological world. But there is a lot of other stuff that has been going on. People have discovered things like epigenetic inheritance, for instance, which is not the same thing as inheriting characters developed during the lifetime of an individual. It's not acquired inheritance, but it is an interesting thing that needs to be put in to the synthesis. We've discovered a lot of interesting things in developmental biology, physiology, et cetera. So we are now in the process, and it is a controversial process because, of course, there are some people, like my good colleague Jerry Coyne, who says that, no, we don't need an extended synthesis. This is all stuff that is at least implied in the modern synthesis. I happen to disagree. I and several other people happen to disagree. History will tell us who is going to be right. Either way, however, I want to emphasize the extended synthesis is not a replacement of, a rejection of the modern synthesis or of the original Darwinism.
Thank you so much, Professor Massimo. That's a very comprehensive and informative answer. A natural question that arises from that answer that Professor Massimo gave, and I'm going to put this to you, Scott, is if we have all of these fields being integrated into an extended evolutionary synthesis, then why would we need to, have a third way?
I think the key word in Massimo's summary of the extended evolutionary synthesis came up when he spoke about the appearance of design, and implied in that is that there's not really design going on. It's only apparent, and therefore we need to somehow come up with a a mechanism of inheritance and evolution that looks like it's designed, but it's really not. And we've tended to avoid this issue of design because Massimo is correct. The thinking about design actually is direct descendant from natural theology and William Paley's very, very interesting work. Darwin actually was quite taken with William Paley when he was a student at Cambridge and gradually moved away from it, as Massimo has said. But the crucial question here is that if you look at plants and animals, and just to take as an example the structure of bones in a vertebrate skeleton, if you measure the things like the strength of the materials and the length versus the diameter and all those sorts of things, if you apply a mechanical engineering viewpoint to this, there's your appearance of design right there. It looks like, when you're talking about design of cantilevers and so forth and so on, bones look an awful lot like they were designed by a mechanical engineer, and there and there has to be some explanation for that. And the third way of evolution really, I think, takes on this question directly: is there such a thing as apparent design, or is it actual design? And we've tended to stay away from the word design because it sounds a lot like we're talking about natural theology, which Massimo is correct. Intelligent design theory is basically a modern version of natural theology, but there has to be some explanation there besides inheritance and besides just developmental biology. And the key issue there is that if you look at the ways in which bones, for example, to stay there, actually come to be shaped the way that they are, it's very clear that there's a very dynamic process going on there, and there's continual addition of bone material, continual removal of bone material, and when those things balance out, you end up with a bone that looks as if it was designed by a mechanical engineer. But what really brings about that design is a quite remarkable information network that exists within the bone, which measures strains and adds material where the strain is too big, that is, the bone is too weak, takes it away from areas where the bone is too strong, that is, the strains are too small. And there is a kind of intelligence there. It's not the kind of Platonic intelligence that the intelligent design people like to invoke. Rather, it's a kind of Aristotelian internal intelligence network that actually produces a structure that looks as if it's designed. And I would go further and say it doesn't just look like it's designed; it is designed by the actions of the agents that work to shape the bone. And so that's something that comes under the rubric of a widely misunderstood term, namely homeostasis. And what you have here in the case of these designed bones is that you have a kind of strain homeostasis that exists inside the bone, which actually produces a designed bone. That is something that is structured in order to perform the function that it needs to. And you see examples of this principle of homeostasis operating throughout all kinds of aspects of good function of living things. You see it in bones, you see it in blood vascular networks, you see it in the structure of trees, all those sorts of things. And at the heart of it is this kind of active, and I'm going to use scare quotes here, intelligent reshaping of a structure or a process so that it performs actually as if it is designed. And that's a perspective that actually I think is missing from the extended evolutionary synthesis. It's certainly missing from intelligent design theory. And that's why we think there has to be a third way of looking at this, one that actually takes into account that living systems are intelligent systems. They're purposeful, and they have actual intentionality operating. And I don't think the extended evolutionary synthesis accounts for that very well.
That's it, because there's nothing, in my opinion, to account for.
This what you just,
of course, but I mean, that's what you just said. Literally brings the debate back 2,000 years. You just mentioned Aristotle. I mean, we're done with Aristotelian science a long time ago, and now somebody is, you guys are trying to bring it back for no particular reason. For one thing, for example, it is well understood both in science, but especially in philosophy of science, that one of the basic distinctions that underline this discussion is the difference between teleology and teleonomy. Teleology means purpose. A system refers to systems that have a purpose. It's a word that was used by Aristotle. Mm-hmm. And Aristotle did not mean the purpose as in an intelligent designer purpose. It says there is an internal striving that living organisms have that brings them to certain ends, right? So his famous example, for instance, is the seedling of a tree. It has inherent in itself this striving to become a tree. The telos, that is the final goal of a seedling, is to become a tree. Great. But that's exactly what modern evolutionary biology does away with, replacing the concept of teleology with teleonomy. Teleonomy literally means appearance of design. We know what's happening in the case of the seedling. It doesn't have any internal striving or biological force or elan vital, which was another concept that was very popular at the beginning, the end of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. That also we've done away with. What it is the seedling has a set of genes, and it has a developmental system which interacting in certain ways with a environment that is conducive to the development of a sapling becomes a tree. I mean, we have the answer. We know what's going on there. So to add things like, well, it looks like intelligence in scare quotes, or it looks like there is purpose or something, doesn't add anything at all to the explanation. We have a broad explanation of how these things work. Do we have all the details? Absolutely not. We might never have all the details, but that's the nature of science. It's not just in biology. That's in every other discipline. So I'm not sure really what the impetus for this whole thing is in the first place. And in my mind, this really does look going back in time, if not to Aristotle. Well, in some cases to Aristotle himself. In other cases, at least by a century and a half. Also, I will question the notion that living organisms look like the engineered. No, they don't. Absolutely not. An engineering system is very different from a biological system. That's a metaphor that certain biologists sometimes use, especially molecular biologists. And it's a mistaken metaphor. It's a bad metaphor. And if you actually look at the structure of biological organisms, biological systems, and compare them with the structure of actual engineering systems, such as, a bridge, for instance, they're completely different. A good engineer, for one thing, always builds in multiple redundant systems into whatever it is building. A lot of biological systems don't have redundancy. It would be nice, for instance, to have two hearts. If my first heart fails, the second one kicks in. There's no such a thing. Why not? Because it's superfluous from the point of view of natural selection. And therefore, because the survival of the organ, a second heart costs too much in terms of metabolism, and it doesn't bring enough positive consequences for natural selections to bring it in. Engineering systems are very neat, very precise. You can always tell. You can reverse engineer. The word reverse engineer a artificial system, because they are very precise. You can see every single part and what is it for. Every part has a reason to be there. That's just not the case in biological systems. There's a lot of parts that don't have function, used to have functions, and they don't anymore. There is a lot of blobs stuff. There is, if you look at an actual cell, inside an actual cell, as opposed to the simplified diagrams of a cell that you find in many molecular biology textbooks. It doesn't look at all like a built thing. And this is being pointed out not just by me or a few other people in modern times. This is being pointed out by David Hume. David Hume in the 18th century, before Darwin and before Paley, published the best argument against intelligent design. And one of the arguments that Hume pointed out is like, look, if you actually look at how the universe works as a system and biological system, they don't look at all like they're designed, or certainly not designed in any way as what we normally mean by the word design. So all of this makes it, to me, there are also, of course, well-known and well-documented examples of bad design in biology. The human body is a great example of pretty bad design, starting with the blind spot in our eye, for instance, which somehow octopus doesn't have. Why not? Why is it that octopus don't have the blind spot and we do? Well, the answer actually has to do with the evolution and developmental biology of the two systems. But the human eye is most definitely not ideally, not optimally designed. And it's not the only part. Because human beings have evolved in erect posture, we started walking on two legs relatively recently in evolution. There are all sorts of bad stuff that happened that natural selection hasn't been able to fix yet. Including the fact that human women have a hell of a hard time giving birth to babies. If you compare a human birth to, for instance, a chimpanzee, which is our closest relative, the chimpanzees just have no problem at all. They just squat, take the baby out, and put it out there, and it starts walking. That's it. But because of the recency of the evolution of human erect posture, there are all sorts of bad stuff. We have varicose veins, we have bone problems, we have all sorts of stuff that are the result of the fact that our body is definitely suboptimally designed. If it was an actual designer, that designer should be fired.
Well, I would just point out that there are indeed organisms, many examples of organisms that do have multiple hearts, including, if you look at the function of it, the human cardiovascular system. And so
that's news to me. Well, I have a second heart. I didn't know it.
Yeah, it's in your muscles, actually.
So you're defining heart in a way that it's not the standard way. That way, yeah, sure. Then we have multiple hearts.
Yeah. I mean, it's a heart is a device for doing work on moving fluids, and the muscles do that. And
yeah, but come on, that's just a semantic trick. That's not.
Excuse me.
And the fact.
What's semantic about that? If we're looking at the function of hearts are to move blood around the body, and certainly there are centrally contained heart, which actually is two hearts that have come together, by the way.
Evolutionarily, yes.
Yes, that's right. And if you're looking at the heart as a functional unit, then there's more than the heart that moves blood around. And this happens in humans. It happens in other creatures. There are lots of examples in the animal kingdom, for example, where there are multiple hearts. And so.
But my point is that those examples, just like the octopus that has no blind eye, and we do, those examples are scattered around, and each one of those, in terms of being explained, requires a knowledge of the specific adaptations, the specific evolutionary history, et cetera, et cetera. Those are not good evidence of design. Those are precisely because they're so haphazard, precisely because every lineage does different things in response to different environmental conditions.
What makes them good design is that they function, and so
sure. Nobody doubts that.
Okay, then what is it that makes them function in a way that makes them look designed? This is.
It looks designed to you. It doesn't. That's a value judgment. I mean, it looks designed. It's just a value judgment. The Darwinian explanation is the one I just said before. It's based on natural selection.
About modern evolutionary biology. I mean,
sorry, say that again.
The appearance of design. This argument runs throughout evolutionary science these days. Richard Dawkins, for example, loves to talk about apparent design.
Sure. But Dawkins,
multiple times. So that in itself is a value judgment, and that's the value judgment that the third way of evolution is actually questioning. It's delving deep into it.
Well, I mean, everybody has the right to question whatever they want, but the thing that we're discussing here is whether there is an actual reason to do so, and I don't think so. What Dawkins is talking about when he uses that language, and you know this, he's responding to intelligent design creationists.
Yes, that's right.
Right. So that's the only reason he's using the word appearance of design, because he's trying to explain why it is in fact an appearance. It's not design or no design. There is functionality, that's for sure. But the current theory of evolution explains functionality pretty well. There's nothing major missing there that I can see. Functionality is the result of a process of genetic mutations and a lot of other genetic processes, development, and which eventually leads to physiology, and of course natural selection that kind of chooses one way or the other which systems work and which ones don't. That's it. That's the picture. There is nothing missing there that I can see. Yeah, so sorry, you've been trying to intervene, and you're the host.
I'm really enjoying this conversation. I want you to bring in an element to try and bring it from the conceptual to the concrete. So this is in regards to the construction of termite mounds, right? So the idea in the past, the sort of standard neo-Darwinian idea was that these sort of mounds were built by genetically determined behavior. And I remember interviewing Scott about this, and he was explaining how the design of the mound, which itself is an organism, is by the termites who are acting like free agents. So the causality isn't, starting off from the genetic level, moving into, the greater organism. Actually, that's where the causality starts off in part from the cognition of the termites. And, we can talk about not only termites, but also a few other examples like this, where the causality is not at the genetic level, or is claimed to be at the organism level. And that was my understanding, Scott, of where you were inserting design in. Could you just explain that point?
Well, sure. I just want to make one point in response to what Massimo was just saying, and then get into this. When Richard Dawkins is criticizing actual design, he's really talking about the teleology of the Platonic God, and as we mentioned, natural theology has a very Platonic origin. Intelligent design right now is basically rewarmed natural theology, but I don't think it's quite true that we can safely discard everything from the pre-Socratic philosophers, and we'll come back to this this question in terms of the issue of termite mounds. If you look at the Aristotelian idea, that is, that there's this kind of internal striving of organisms towards a particular form, that's something that distinguishes Aristotle somewhat from Plato. And if you come into the modern era, and certainly with physiology, the modern conception, or the modern foundation of experimental physiology, is Claude Bernard, and his concept of homeostasis is very much close cousin to Aristotle's bios. That is, this internal notion that there's a state that organisms strive to, and that's what homeostasis is.
No, organisms don't strive for anything. I'm sorry.
Yes,
no, come on. Homeostasis, no. Homeostasis is a thing that has been, okay, you can repeat whatever you want, but the homeostasis has been understood for a while. There's no mystery in homeostasis. I know you guys bring this up constantly as if it were some kind of magical bullet, but it's not. Homeostasis is simply the naturally selected behavior of organisms to maintain a certain internal state, because that's optimal for their functioning. That's all. And it's explained by the usual array of explanations. That is, there is a genetic basis for it. That genetic basis influences the development. The development leads to the physiology. There is really nothing there else that then is mysterious. So I don't see why homeostasis is a particular thing. Do you want to go to the termite mounds, for instance? First of all, no, the termite mound is not an organism. Organisms are the individual termites, and then sometimes zoologists talk about a superorganism in terms of the entire colony. Meaning that they treat individual termites as kind of analogous to cells in an organism. The reason for that, however, is because so-called eusocial insects have a very particular genetic structure, which is different from most of everything else on the planet, and that genetic structure does bring about certain kind of behaviors that are better understood if you think of the entire colony as the organism as opposed to the individual insects. But again, there is no mystery there. That theory has been worked out in the 1960s. This is no magic.
Well, termites' genetic structure is actually very different from that of the hymenopteran social
Yes, it is.
And so the explanation that there's this genetic predisposition to sociality among all social insects is simply not true. And when it comes to the termite mound, this is a structure.
How do you know that? I'm sorry.
How do I know what?
That's a big claim that there is no genetic. You know that there is no genetic predisposition among termites. Social predisposition. How do you know that?
If you take Hamilton's notion of the different patterns of inheritance in male and female bees or ants or what have you, that's the classic explanation for sociality, evolution of sociality in social insects. When you come to termites, they have the same kind of inheritance that we do, for example. There's
and we are social animals. In fact, do you are you suggesting there is no genetic tendency for human beings to be social?
No, I'm saying that that there are lots of organisms out there that have the same patterns of inheritance that we do and that termites do that aren't social. And so this notion that the whole issue of sociality has been solved by this genetic theory that came from Hamilton in the 1960s, as you say, it just doesn't stand up. And
no, that's not true at all. That's not true at all. I mean, okay, sure. No, I'm sorry. In evolutionary biology, it is well known that similar patterns can evolve from different causal paths and different evolutionary paths. So Hamilton's theory accounts for the eusociality of certain classes of insects, and then we have different explanations for other classes, for other examples. That again, it's not a mystery. This is something that is completely within the purview of the modern synthesis. You don't even need an extended synthesis for that. This is just standard biology.
What is it that explains the evolution of sociality in ourselves, then, Massimo?
In ourselves?
Yes.
Well, there are plenty of social species of primates.
Oh, I'm asking about ourselves.
Why are you asking about ourselves? The answer, since we're talking about evolution, is not just ourselves. You have to go to our close cousins, right? So there is one strategy for primates has been the evolution of social cooperation. Social cooperation enhances survival. Mm-hmm. Again, no mystery there.
And what reinforces that?
What do you mean? I'm not sure what you mean by reinforces.
Okay, well, there are lots of interactions between animals of the same species that don't necessarily result in social interactions. And so what is it about our interactions that helps us become social, that explains why we have evolved as highly social organisms?
Again, I'm not sure what you're talking about. What are you asking?
Well,
sociality,
is it genetic or is it cultural?
Component.
Is it genetic?
Those are not mutual. Those are not mutually exclusive. Culture is well known. The theory of cultural evolution, it goes hand in hand with the theory of genetic evolution. Cultural norms reinforce often genetic predispositions. For instance, let's take the example of incest, which is almost universal among human cultures. It's also very likely to be a genetic predisposition because there are negative consequences on fitness that are generated by incest.
So you see no essential difference between cultural evolution and genetically based evolution?
I did not say that. I did not say that.
Well, then explain to me, what is it about the culture?
Sorry, hold on a second. You keep that's an interesting game that you're playing there. You keep asking me to explain things. You're the one that is actually suggesting that there is something fundamentally wrong with the current theory of evolution, to the point that you don't want to just expand it, you want to actually reject it. So why don't you explain to me how things work? I think the burden of proof is on you, not me.
I think that the problem. Sorry, Sabur, you wanted to. I'm not trying to evade the question, but I see Sabur trying to break in here.
Just before you answer, maybe it'd be helpful to speak about if the extended evolutionary synthesis is wedded to the gene-centric view, because that seems to be where this conversation is headed. Whether the gene-centric view is correct, because from my understanding of the third way, and I could be wrong, is that seems to be the main issue of third way evolutionists, that they don't see the gene-centric view as being sufficient to explain sociality or even the evolution.
Yeah, but almost nobody sees the gene-centric view as sufficient. We keep bringing up Dawkins. Dawkins is a bad example. Dawkins is, first of all, hasn't been an active scientist for decades. He's a very good science popularizer, but he's not the paragon of what's going on in evolutionary biology, and it hasn't been for literally decades. So let's set Dawkins and his gene-centric stuff aside. Gene-centrism has been criticized since the 1940s. This is not a new thing. And little by little, biologists have moved away from, the standard models in population genetics, which are certainly gene-centric, to include things like physiology development, the so-called Evo-Devo explosion of studies in the 1990s and early 2000s, for instance. That's evolution of development. That's all about expanding the paradigm beyond gene-centrism. But gene-centrism was historically was necessary because, remember, as I said at the beginning, Darwinism went through a crisis with the discovery of the new discoveries of genetics at the beginning of the 20th century. There seemed to be a problem, so people had to solve that problem. Since the problem was caused by genetics, then it stands to reason that the first responses were gene-centric. But as I said, even the architects of the modern synthesis, like Ernst Mayr, immediately realized that gene-centrism was not the full answer. It was a part of the answer, but definitely not the full answer. As far as levels of causality, because that's come up several times. Again, there is a well-established recognition of multiple levels of causality. The multi-level selection theory is fairly well-established, even within the modern synthesis. That don't even need to go to the extended synthesis. So it's not like biologists don't know this stuff. They understand that when you want to explain, for instance, biological systems, or frankly, any other natural system, there are different levels of explanation. And the level of explanation that is most germane or multiple levels of explanation that are most germane are the ones that are most useful epistemologically for that particular problem. So if the problem is one of human physiology, then you're going to go to physiology and developmental biology, maybe. If the problem is more of interactions between genes and environments, then you need both the genetic component and the ecology. It depends, but so again, nothing new here.
Sure. Scott, sorry, I interrupted your previous answer. I just wanted you to add in the gene-centric view, but I guess you can respond to both points now.
Well, okay, I will. The point I was driving at, and it's not a game, it's a query. What is it that enforces the social structure of human beings? And of course, Trivers has gone through this whole theory of reciprocal altruism and all these kinds of things. And what's happening there is it's not so much genetic. It's actually a social interaction that involves information, and that involves intelligence. It involves various kinds of things that I don't think that geneticists have an adequate explanation for. And so when we're talking about, we can have an extended evolutionary synthesis that brings in all these kinds of things, but then you stick to the basically, well, at the heart of it is this idea that genes are very important in determining that. I think you're papering over a lot of real difficulties with the whole Darwinian idea. And
no, I'm sorry, I'm not papering over anything. There are certainly a lot of questions to which we don't have answers. Good, thank Zeus for that, because otherwise I'd be out of business as an evolutionary biologist, right? But one thing is to say there are questions that we're still working on. Oh, we don't know the details about a lot of stuff that's going on in the biological world. Another thing is much more radically to say we got everything wrong. There's something fundamentally wrong about the way in which we understand the biological world. That's what you're saying. That, as Carl Sagan famously put it, is an extraordinary claim and therefore requires extraordinary evidence. I've looked at the literature on the third way. Other than a lot of words and rhetoric, I don't see anything substantive. Where does this alleged intelligence in scare quotes come from? What does it consist of? Why the scare quotes? And so on and so forth. I mean, are we saying that living organisms have some kind of internal drive? Yes, and we know where that drive comes from. Right?
Where does it come from?
They got genes, and the genes make possible a certain developmental system. This developmental system.
Right back to the genes.
Sorry, let me finish. The developmental system interacts. No, we don't. See, that's the problem. We don't have just the genes. The genes are the starting point. The genes make possible certain developmental systems. Developmental systems develop in a certain environment, and that generates certain trajectories, and therefore the adult individual, the physiology, etc., etc. If you change any of those things, if you grow an organism that needs oxygen in a atmosphere without oxygens, it doesn't matter what kinds of genes it's going to have. It doesn't matter what kind of development it's going to have. It's going to die. So yes, the environment is crucial. No kidding. If you interfere otherwise with the development of an organism, also you're going to create an organism that doesn't function properly when it is an adult. But at the end of the day, one of the things you asked before, what makes us a social species? That is our genetic background. Our genetic background has, of course, to interact with our culture, which is part of our environment. It is a recursive system. The culture and the genetic system interact constantly throughout our development as both individuals and societies. No question about it. But if you change the genetics of human beings, you will not have a culture. That's just the way it works. You can't just mess around with the genes and have the same result independently. So when you say, well, the biologists think that, evolutionary synthesis think that the genes are crucial. Yeah, they're crucial. Absolutely. But crucial doesn't mean that they're the only ones playing a causal role. I mean, we've known this for a long time. We should not confuse the having a crucial role with having an exclusionary role. They're not the same thing.
So then, if we're going to include these other things to consider when we're trying to come up with a coherent theory of evolution, then where do you draw the limits? I think that
what limits do you want me to draw?
Well,
what do you want?
You've
exactly?
just mentioned that we can rule out Aristotle, we can rule out Plato, we can rule out Lamarck. I can agree with you that Plato is probably not the right inspiration, because one of the descendants of Platonic thinking is actually our current intelligent design theory. Right. But I don't think you can philosophically rule out other kinds of philosophical approaches to it. And
well, tell me what they bring. So, for instance, let's talk about Aristotle.
What does he
bring to the table?
What he brings is his notion of an internal striving towards a particular form, and
right.
You yourself,
which, as I said before, we have an account for now in mechanistic terms, right? We know that striving is the result.
I don't think we have a full account.
What do you mean by full? What is missing?
The ways in which living things actually shape themselves to be adaptable, and that implies a kind of internal striving. And
no, it doesn't.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Because
why? You need to explain why. I mean, we have explanations for what you call.
I'm trying.
Well, I don't know. Are you really? Because all you're saying is there are things that we don't understand. Fine, granted. And then you keep talking about, we need to explain why organisms are this way or the other. We have an explanation. You do not accept it. So what are you proposing as an addition or in fact, you're not saying an addition, you're saying an alternative. What would be an Aristotelian mechanism? Exactly. I want the details. I don't want just genetic talk about, oh, well, there's striving. What exactly would...
How is it that a bone knows to...
No. You're asking a question. I want an answer. No, I want an answer from you.
Okay. A bone knows to shape itself in a particular way under a particular environment to strain, and the forces acting on it. A bone knows how to do this.
Right. And how does it know that? And how does it know that? No, you haven't.
Yeah, okay, I'll go into the detailed explanation. You have different populations of cells in the bones that exist in the information network. They compare information with one another, a sense of strain, and some populations of bones add calcium phosphate to the bone, others take it away. And these things actually regulate the bone structure so that they have a constant strain acting throughout the bone. And this occurs in normally developed bone. It occurs in bones that are fractured and then been reknit. And that's a striving. That's an internal striving based upon the sensation.
Try to avoid words. I'm sorry, but try to avoid words that are question begging. Striving is question begging.
Okay, they're engaging in strain homeostasis. That's why I say that homeostasis is close cousin to Aristotle's bios. That's what I'm saying, and that's an internal striving.
I'm sorry, I don't know what that means. I honestly don't know what that means. What you just described are well-known developmental processes. What makes those processes possible is the fact that cells themselves, of course, have genetic information. If you alter that genetic information, those cells will not be able to do the kind of thing you just described.
So then you're going right back to genes. This is the principal criticism of the third way of evolution, the extended evolutionary synthesis. It always regresses to genetic natural selection. That's what it regresses to.
Yeah, it does. Because fundamentally, that's what's going on. Of course, genetics and natural selection do bring about the kind of complex, higher level phenomena you're talking about. Yeah. But are you going to disagree that if I cause a mutation in those cells will not be able to assemble in the way you just described?
The third way of evolution doesn't negate genetics. It doesn't deny genetics. It just says that it's insufficient to explain the phenomena of life that we see.
Yes,
and it's insufficient to explain the evolution of life as we see it. That's our criticism.
Right. And what does but you still have not told me, at least if you have, I'm sorry, I did not hear it. What else is missing? Don't say striving, because that's begging the question. It's just a label. Striving doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any kind of cache. If I say, a biological process is caused by natural selection and genes, I can give you a very specific amount of information about what that means, and you know it.
And so can I.
But when you say striving, no. When you say, I looked at not your publications, but the publications of the third way that I could find, there is no explanation. There is just a repeat of, oh, there are things missing over here, and the answer is striving, internal mechanism, intelligence in scare quote. Okay, let's unpack it. What do those things mean?
Okay, so could I just to facilitate this conversation?
You're the host.
I want you to bring in Barbara McClintock's. Jane Shapiro, her sort of inheritor, his idea of natural genetic engineering, or her idea of genome reconstruction, that seems to undermine genes being given a privileged level of causality, which seems to be what the extended evolutionary synthesis proponents subscribe to.
No and no. So McClintock famously discovered transposable elements. Transposable elements, it's an interesting discovery for sure. And yes, they can be used in actual human genetic engineering. But they're essentially, from a formal perspective, they're a different kind of mutation. It's not a point mutation. Geneticists recognize now, initially, they only recognize so-called point mutations, that is individual bases, as we understood it later, individual bases of DNA that change. But now the number of mutational changes is huge. It includes transposons, it includes inversions of entire segments of chromosomes, all of that stuff. All of those things are mutations. And all of them provide material for natural selection. So no, McClintock does not put generate any kind of crisis in the current paradigm in evolutionary biology. In terms of it all comes down to that, as I said, no, we recognize multiple levels of causality, but at the end of the day, one fundamental level of causality that you cannot do without is the genetic one. And we know that how? Well, because if you do cause mutations, which we can in living organisms, you will get all sorts of repercussions at the level of physiology, at the level of developmental biology, at the level of ecology. We know this. This has been known for decades. So you cannot do without the genetic level of analysis. That doesn't mean it's the only one. I'm an ecologist. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I work at different levels of analysis. So I understand that it's not all about the genes. But you take the genes out, or you dramatically reduce the causal import of genes, you need something to replace them with. And so far, I haven't heard any that does replace them.
Well,
Scott,
I would argue that in fact there is a credible argument for these multiple levels of causation, and I agree with what you're saying there, Massimo, that genes are significant. There's no question about it, and things like reconstruction of genes, as was indicated, or I should say reconstruction of chromosomes as indicated by mobile genetic elements, and all those kinds of things, and that sort of thing are important. The third way of evolution is not denying the importance of genes. What the third way of evolution is saying is that genes, the genetics explanation for structure and function, is insufficient in and of itself. And when we're talking about these multiple levels of causation, what the third way of evolution is saying, and I'm probably on the fringes of that, I'll quite own that, is that what you need to consider as a factor is the fundamental intelligence of living systems. You can have these genetic mutations going on, and yet you can still have a living organism at the end of it. It will function very differently, but it's still going to be a living organism. And when you ask, well, what is it that enables that organism to keep on living despite having genetic anomalies or differentiation there, I don't think you can get away from treating living things as intelligent. And I know you want to close off the debate from this word, striving organisms towards a particular end. And that's why I say, and this is not shared by all members of the third way group, is that you need to be able to account for that in developing a coherent theory of evolution. Right. And the third way, and the extended evolutionary synthesis doesn't do that.
That's not the case. But so first of all, I don't want to close the debate on anything. All I'm trying to do.
I can't use striving.
No, you can use whatever you want. All I say is, can you unpack it? Can you give me a mechanism?
Yes,
can you give me some? And that is because I've been asking several times. No,
and I have tried. No, I've tried.
Please indulge me. Give it to me one more time. Okay. What is the mechanism behind the striving?
How much detail do you want? Well, I've already gone through
whatever you like. It's up to Sub, or he's our host. So,
I want you to move away to Gene.
I just want to give a word in response to Massimo's question, and that is homeostasis. Yeah. And it's not just a cybernetic explanation, which is the prevalent one right now. Claude Bernard's own conception of homeostasis or self-regulation, it doesn't rely on Alain Vital or any of those kinds of things, but it does rely on a different way of looking at the striving of living systems towards a steady, persistent function.
Right, but we have a perfectly fine explanation of homeostasis.
It's not genetic. I don't think it's genetic, Massimo.
What do you mean? What do you mean it's not genetic?
It's not entirely genetic. It's not entirely genetic. It's
what's missing
genetic.
then?
What's missing is the information and the intelligence of living systems, and this goes all the way down even to cells, individual cells, that produces a persistent function in a living system, even though you might have variations of genetic function.
All right, let me ask you a question. I know Sabor wants to definitely bring us in a different direction, but since we've been going around in circles for a while, let me ask you, what sort of experiments would you do to test the third way that are different from the modern synthesis or the extended synthesis?
That's a brilliant question.
It is, yeah, and I will concede the point. There's not a lot of good experimental tests of it. I mean, in the case of my own work, we've done things like vary the environment that the termites are trying to regulate, and this includes not only experimental variation but also variation in local environments, and watching the response of the structure that is built by these termites, and that's about the only way I can think of it. But I will freely admit that I'm kind of out there on the fringe on this whole issue, and this comes from the work that I've done with termite mounds. But there really aren't a lot of good experimental tests out there, but I think we will come up with them. And one of the things that is going to be crucial to that is not just dismissing it as just a bunch of nonsense. We have a perfectly adequate explanation. That's all we need to be able to explore these questions. And so I'm saying, and the third way group is saying, basically, we really need to broaden the perspective, not just the experimental perspective, but the philosophical perspective on evolutionary.
Well, first of all, thank you for being open about this. I was about to say honest, but I have no reason to think that you've been non-honest throughout, so that's not the right word. The right word is no. Of course, I mean, of course, we're here in good faith.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thanks for acknowledging that. It's not a question in my mind of dismissing it. I mean, look, what you're going through now is pretty much what I've been going through most of my careers, advocating for the evolution, for the extended synthesis. So I know exactly what it feels. As I said, my dear colleague Jerry Coyne, he has said all sorts of horrible things about me. Yeah, I know. Yes, I checked. So it's not that I don't understand the reaction of the establishment, so to speak, or the orthodoxy, et cetera, et cetera. I understand that. One major difference, however, two major differences, I guess, that I see between the extended synthesis and the third way is that, number one, the extended synthesis has produced a large number of empirical material to support its ideas. Now, whether that material is sufficient enough to back up the claims of the extended synthesis, or can it actually be reduced, as Coyne says, to standard modern? That's an open debate, and in some sense, it actually is a philosophical debate more than a scientific debate. But the fact is, not even Jerry, for instance, denies at this point that there is such a thing as epigenetic inheritance, that there is such a thing as phenotypic plasticity, the ability of organisms to respond to different environments, even with the same genetic background. That's what I spent most of my career working on. So there is no denying of the empirical evidence. We're having debates about, well, yes, but what does that mean in terms of the big picture? One difference, therefore, with the third way is that, as you just said, that empirical backing, as you just said, one difference is that the empirical backing is missing, at least for now. The other thing is, you said this is also in part a philosophical debate. Right, it is. And I'm as a philosopher of science, I certainly all in favor of philosophical debates. But the fact is, from my perspective, we have had these debates before. Right? There has been a rejection of Aristotelian science ever since Francis Bacon wrote the New Organon. There has been a rejection of vitalism, which sometimes somewhere lurks around, in my opinion, the ideas of the third way. That's been done. There is a rejection of any kind of teleonomy. That's also been done. So now, of course, is it possible that all those rejections were premature and misguided? Sure. But the bar at this point is pretty high, right? Especially because you're not saying, look, there is this other stuff on top of what we already know, and we need to add it. That's the extended synthesis. You're actually saying that there is something fundamentally wrong with a scientific theory that has been pretty much surviving all challenges over the last 170 years. So that's a tall order. And I don't see you guys anywhere near reaching that tall order. That's my position.
Yeah, just to add to your point, Professor Massimo, that in terms of my understanding, at least of the third way, Professor Scott, is the main reason that I think the third way proponents are challenging the extended evolutionary synthesis and want to replace it with a new one. It seems to be the work of McClintock. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because often I've seen third way proponents refer to the Human Genome Project 2001 paper, in which they're claiming that the majority of the changes in terms of all the different organisms from worms all the way to humans is not due to random mutations gradually over a long period of time, but it's actually due to genome reorganization. And that seems to be the thrust of the argument for why they're saying that Darwinism is not sufficient. So could you first explain if I've misrepresented third way? Because that seems to be my understanding for why they are asking for a new synthesis.
Me? Are you asking me, Massimo?
Yeah, I'm asking you. That seems to be my understanding of what the third way proponents are saying.
Yeah. Let me come to your question, and let me just make a couple of responses. Respond to a couple of points that Massimo has just made. There is a great deal of empirical evidence, actually, for the intelligent striving of organisms towards form. It occurs mostly in the fields of physiology and to an extent development. The question is, what evidence counts as being admissible into the debate over evolutionary biology? And certainly you're correct, Massimo, that the bar is very, very high, but the bar is never insurmountable. I mean, that's the way science works. And at least part of what we're arguing is that it's time to maybe expand our philosophical perspectives on what life is and what evolution is and what drives it and so forth, with the hope that we'll be able to move forward. I think we're pretty much in agreement on that. Coming back to the epigenetics and the McClintock argument that you just brought up, Sabur, that's certainly a component of some members of the third way movement. So Jim Shapiro, for example, has a very extensive and well publicized take on this. That when you look at the connection between genetic code and function, the genome is actually part of the physiology, if you will, of the cell, and the bottom line there is that it really closes the kind of central dogma that is function can come back and influence the expression of genes as much as the genes can express the influence of function. So it's really a conversation there. So that's certainly a well-represented part of the third way of evolution group. As I said, you can look at me as probably pretty far out there on the fringe, bringing in the notion that no, we cannot escape considering the obvious intentionality and purposefulness and intention and intelligence that is expressed in bringing about the living form. And so the third way of evolution actually covers a broad range of philosophical and scientific perspectives to this, and basically what we're saying is that there's alternatives to the extended evolutionary synthesis. We need to, we're not saying that it's wrong. We're saying that it's maybe incomplete, and that we should expand our perspectives.
I thought you were saying that it is wrong. Everything that I read about the third way. Hold on a second. I read stuff about the third way. It's a rejection of Darwinism. That's how you guys sell yourself. Well,
that may be how some of us sell ourselves. And well, I will again be quite honest. I've come to the conclusion that Darwinism itself is fundamentally incomplete. So, but as I said, I'm part of the fringe of this whole movement, and I've come there, through, I hope, honest means, scientific means, and so forth. But there's no rejection of the science of genetics. In fact, we're seeing that the science of genetics, including epigenetics, is actually making the point that the gene-focused emphasis of the extended evolutionary synthesis, and in fact of what Darwinism has become, is incomplete. And I would argue, for example, that I don't think you can explain evolution through Darwinian means, but that doesn't mean that I think that genetics is wrong. I'm not talking about rejecting.
So you have a problem with natural selection?
I do.
What's the problem?
I don't think you can have natural selection if you have an intelligent being, and I'm talking about organisms now, making the selection.
And right, okay, sure, but of course, from my perspective, there is no evidence that we have intelligent beings, so that's fine.
Yeah. Well.
Okay, a couple of clarifications. First of all, the central dogma, which we have known for decades. Again, it's not correct. In certain organisms, plants, for instance, we know that, but it doesn't say what you just said before. There is no problem for the central dogma simply says that the environment isn't going to be able to change the genetic information, except for, of course, for mutations, but not in a functional way. That's all it says. The notion that the environment alters the gene expression, that's been known for a long time, and it's incorporated in the modern synthesis. So that is not a violation of the central dogma of molecular biology. Number one. Number two, we've been talking a lot about genetics, the new genetics, let's say the Menklitok and discoveries, etc., which is not new anymore. It's been actually decades, but somehow posing a problem for Darwin. It doesn't. Remember that I said right at the beginning in my summary of the history of evolutionary biology, Darwin did not have a theory of heredity. That means natural selection is conceptually independent of the details of heredity. So it doesn't matter whether heredity works in one way or another, however it works, so long as there is heredity, and so long as there is a source of variation in the genetic material, in the inheritance material, that's all you need for natural selection. So it's a misconception that any new discovery concerning either the structure of the genetic material or the way in which the genetic material is propagated from one generation to another, that those are somehow problems for Darwinism. They're not, because Darwinism treats inheritance as a black box.
Yeah, but if you're looking at these feedbacks that the new genetics, if you will, is starting to reveal, if the environment, physiology of the cell influences the genome, if you will, in however way you want to talk about it, and the ways in which that can happen are becoming
the
broader.
Gene expression, which is different from the
gene
genome
expression, but it still influences the translation of sequence code in the DNA molecule into actual function. This is a two-way conversation, and it happens within the cell, and it happens between the cell and the environment in which the cell exists. And this extends all the way up through all scales of organization, I would argue. And so when you're looking at the interaction between a living system and its environment, you're talking about the ability of a living system to adapt to its environment, but also the ability of the living system to adapt the environment to itself, to its own physiology. And of course, this is the core element of niche construction theory, which is one of the foundations of the extended evolutionary synthesis.
Right.
What I am arguing is that interaction between the environment and the living system is a fundamentally intelligent process. The living system takes in information about the state of the environment. It can modify the environment in order to keep the flow of matter and energy into it in a way that it can allow that living system to persist. And what epigenetics, the new genetics, does is it allows the possibility of feedback onto that, not only in the expression of genes, but also in the definition of genes right now. So when you're talking about
what do you mean by
gene,
intelligence?
well, it makes decisions, and it makes intelligent decisions toward a particular end.
No. That's kind of begging the question.
Well,
I asked you the definition of intelligence. You said you cannot say intelligence is about making intelligent decisions. That's circular.
It's not. How do we define intelligence?
I'm sorry. No, I don't need to define because I don't need it. No, I'm sorry. Okay, hold on a second.
Okay.
I'm trying to be precise here to be helpful to our listeners, right?
Okay.
If I ask, you are the one using the word intelligence. I'm not. I'm staying away from it, so I don't need a definition of intelligence. You're the ones that's bringing in as a major component of what's going on in the third way.
Yes.
Therefore,
right.
I think it's fair for me to ask for a definition of intelligence. Not a definition in the sense of a dictionary definition. What is it? What do you mean by it? What concept are you actually trying to deploy? And no, the answer cannot be, well, intelligence is about doing intelligent things, because that's totally circular. So what do you mean by intelligence?
Well, how do we define human intelligence?
I don't know. I'm asking you.
Well, I'm asking you. You're saying there's a difference.
I don't need the word intelligence at all to explain anything in terms of evolutionary synthesis.
Sorry to interrupt. Could we say cognition?
No, that just makes it worse. Cognition is even worse.
Term, but that's actually my preferred term.
Okay, sure.
I want to stay away from consciousness, by the way.
But cognition and intelligence are not the same thing, or are they?
But it's part of it, isn't it?
What part of which one? Which one is part of which?
Is part of intelligence.
Sure, you cannot be intelligent if you don't have cognition, but you can have cognition without being intelligent. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay.
And so when you're talking about the persistence of a cell, you can have you can define the cell as a cognitive system. How does the cell know to be able to restructure its own internal physiology in a way that allows its persistence? Genetics is certainly part of it, but
I would argue that the cell doesn't know anything. It doesn't need to know anything.
But it's cognitively aware, isn't it?
No, it's not aware at all. That's another term that it's fraught with, unnecessary meaning. Awareness.
So it's a cognitive system. Then would that be acceptable?
Depends on what you mean. If you give me a good definition of cognition, maybe. If cognition just means the ability to process information, right? Well, then
cognition is the ability.
Then genes are cognitive.
For you, I'll define it precisely for you.
Okay, good.
That is that cognition involves sensing a state of the environment and mapping that onto a cognitive. I should say, creating a cognitive map on the internal environment, which is what cells do. I mean, and that can include alteration of gene editing and expression, the whole system of epigenetic things that we're talking about, as well as reshaping the entire physiology of the cell that reflects what's going on in the external environment. So that's cognition.
But that's not intelligence.
But when you take that cognition and you make a decision on how to modify the environment in a way that allows you to persist, I would argue that is intelligent.
Right. And how is what you just described different from the standard view? The standard view would say the genetic background of a cell makes it possible for the cell to have certain structures. Those structures are capturing information from the environment, and they're responding in certain ways.
The genetic component accounts for part of it. It doesn't account for all of it.
Right. But you keep not telling me what the other part is. Okay, that's fine.
Well, the other part is reshaping the entire physiology of the cell to do things. I mean, the two can the two operate in an intertwined way, but the fact that the physiology of the cell can feedback and influence not just the expression of a gene, but the actual set of nucleotides that are being transcribed into function.
That's expression. That's still expression.
That's still expression, but it's an intelligent expression because it allows the cell, of all the possible outcomes in the universe, to persist. And that is a remarkable thing.
That's exactly what natural selection does. It selects. Well, you might not think so, but we got plenty of experiments to back that up. It's not. I'm not just saying something.
At the heart of it is the cognitive interaction between the cell and its environment.
I'm not sure what adding the word cognition actually does in terms of explanation there.
Because it's what living things do.
Whatever. If you want to use it,
fundamental
that's
to
fine.
what living things do. It's fundamental to what living things do.
Information.
How can you have a coherent theory of life if you don't account for that?
But we do. Contrary to what you keep saying, we do.
My point is that the third way says that no, it's not complete.
And yet, when I ask you the definition of crucial terms, you can't give it to me. And when I ask you for empirical evidence, you admit that there isn't any.
No, I have not said that. I said there's lots of empirical evidence about the functioning of cells, about the way in which homeostasis functions, and those kinds of things.
Yes, but that information
it's not being admitted into the extended evolutionary sense.
No, I'm sorry. That's nonsense. I'm sorry. All of that information you're talking about, all of those experiments you're talking about, are perfectly within the domain of not even the extended synthesis, the modern synthesis. I'm sorry. All of that stuff is well known. I studied that stuff in college, and that was like 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Way before there was any talk of extended synthesis, third way, et cetera, et cetera. So no, I'm not going to grant you that information, that experimental stuff somehow can be counted in favor of the third way. It doesn't. It was produced within the normal paradigm of evolutionary biology, and it has nothing to do with the third way. You can appropriate if you want, but that's a sleight of hand.
Okay, well, then that's, I think, the difference between extended evolutionary synthesis and the third way, then.
Sleight of hand?
No, I think that the extended evolutionary synthesis is insufficient, and I think that's a view that's held quite commonly among the members of the third way movement.
Sure.
And in order for us to have a coherent theory of evolution, we need to be able to broaden our perspective beyond the Darwinian and beyond the genetic.
I'm all for broadening perspectives, but but we're talking science here. Unless the broadening of the perspective, I'm not so sure. I think you're talking more philosophy and history than science. But
yes, that's part of
science means that you broaden the perspective not just for the hell of it. You broaden the perspective if it is actually useful to account for phenomena old and new in ways that are new and more compelling. I haven't heard anything that is new or more compelling in this hour and a half almost a conversation, or in my readings about the third way. So I don't think. So you said before, the bar has to be, possible to overcome. No, it doesn't. Because if you're going in the wrong direction, that bar is infinitely high. And I think you're going in the wrong direction. So I don't think you're ever going to be able to overcome that bar. Of course, could I be mistaken? Sure. But so far, you haven't given any empirical evidence and not even a particularly strong theoretical argument for why we should bother doing this thing in the first place. Of course, people will bother, and okay, maybe if we're lucky, we come back in 10 years and the situation will be different. But I honestly going to bet a good amount of money against it.
Okay, well, I would say in response that, in fact, there is a great deal of empirical evidence, and there's a great deal of philosophical approaches to this that the extended evolutionary synthesis is not willing to admit. And
I think all of the listeners have to do is to rewind about half an hour and find the place where you said that there was no empirical evidence. But sure. You're entitled to change your mind. Yeah, you did.
When I didn't say there was no empirical
evidence. In response to my direct question of what kind of experiments would you bring up in favor to test the ideas of the third way, you said, you're right, there basically isn't any. It's there, it's recorded, and you can go back half an hour and look at it.
But I have also
now you change your mind. That's fine.
No, I'm sorry. I have also said there's plenty of empirical evidence, but one of the problems is that there's a problem in the extended evolutionary synthesis, admitting that as a legitimate source of evidence in the extended evolutionary synthesis. What I said there was that there's not a great deal of experimental tests of what the third way group is advocating, specifically my approach to it. But there are empirical tests, and I would say that once we open the conversation as widely as the third way people think it should be, I think that the ingenuity of our colleagues will come up with some interesting.
The conversation is open. I mean, we're having it right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a
could we say this is? Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Could we say that you both are inferring different theories to explain the same data? Like, say, for example, the genome reorganization, which I keep bringing up. The reason why I keep bringing this up is because it seems to be one of the main drivers of evolution seems to be the organism itself making decisions, right, based upon its environment. And obviously, the extended evolutionary synthesis proponents can say we can explain that starting at the genetic level, and then we can have higher levels of explanations. And third way proponents seem to be saying, no, that example shows that there's something fundamentally wrong with using natural selection as being a all-encompassing paradigm. That seems to, that's my understanding of what's going on here. What do you guys say to that? Like two inferences based upon the same data.
I think there's probably no doubt or no difference or daylight between what Massimo would say about epigenetics and those kinds of topics, the kinds of feedbacks of function onto genes, based, or more fundamentally, sequence of nucleotides and the kinds of markers that limit transcription and so forth. I don't think there'd be any disagreement between us on that, because that's the science after all. But I do think there might be a fundamental difference of perspective on this, in that Massimo, and I'm just putting words in your mouth, which you'll correct me about, no doubt, is adequate to explain everything following there. You will admit that there are other perspectives that can be brought in, but I'm not sure of your reluctance to do so. And what we are saying is that we think these other perspectives need to be brought into the debate, and they can produce, I think, a more coherent theory of evolution than we now have.
Well, look, the fact that we agree on the empirical evidence, it doesn't unfortunately lead us very far, because evolutionary biologists also agree with the same evidence that intelligent design proponents bring up. And yet there are major differences.
We're not intelligent design, by the way. I need to make that clear.
Well, you use the word intelligent and design separately and in scare quotes, but you did. No, I understand that it's not that kind of intelligent design. It's an Aristotelian kind of design. That's fine. But as I said, in my opinion, both Plato and Aristotle, from that perspective, are best filed away in the history of ideas, not in the current science. But so in other words, that actually is part of the problem, Sabor. That is, if we agree that the data are the data, that the empirical evidence is empirical evidence, right? And then the difference comes down to, look, we have an established set of principles within the modern synthesis, and to some extent within the extended synthesis, that we think are an adequate explanation, not for everything, and then nothing explains everything, but they're an adequate explanation, at least in principle, for biological phenomena, for the evidence that we have. But then there is this other group that says, no, they're not. In fact, there's something fundamentally wrong with that explanation. Here is a different one. And yet, that different explanation does not seem to be based on discriminating experimental evidence. It brings in concepts that, frankly, both from a scientific and even from a philosophical perspective, are suspiciously vague, such as cognition, intelligence, striving, it's even worse, and so on and so forth. And they are entirely unnecessary because those concepts are supposed to explain the kind of things for which we already have an explanation in mechanistic terms. Then I don't know what we're doing here. It's an interesting discussion, but not a scientific one. I mean, science. So Einstein famously said, and remember, Einstein is somebody who worked within the queen of sciences, right, physics, and B, who certainly cannot be accused of not caring about either philosophy or theory. He was one of those physicists that clearly said philosophy is important to science, and he certainly was a theoretician, right? Yet, he said, empirical evidence is the alpha and the omega of our understanding of the world, meaning that unless you actually bring in ideas that elucidate in novel ways and are consistent with the empirical evidence, then you're not doing science. And I don't think the third way is doing that. So I don't think it's science at the moment. Could it change? Sure. But at the moment, I don't see it as a viable scientific enterprise.
So over to, thank you for that, Professor Massimo. Over to you, Scott, for a reply, and then I'll ask the last question as we need to wrap up.
I don't yield to anyone on the importance of empirical evidence. I think we are certainly in agreement on that, but even empirical evidence is filtered through philosophical precepts, and my problem with the extended evolutionary synthesis, and in fact with Darwinism, is that it excludes a fundamental attribute of living systems, and I think that it's closing our perspective to eliminate past perspectives on this, because this is a philosophical filter that I think needs to be brought in to have a coherent theory of evolution. And I remain unpersuaded that the extended evolutionary synthesis provides us a coherent theory.
Right, but that's when you say things like that, that sounds to me like vitalism, right?
Like what?
Vitalism. So you're basically saying that there is something fundamentally different about biological organisms, right?
That's
compared
exactly
to non-living matter. That's not only right, and I'm glad we clarified that actually, because that's an important bit. That is not only a challenge to evolutionary biology. That's a challenge to science in general, because biology, not just evolutionary biology, but even biophysics, starts from the conclusion, I guess, or the assumption, however you want to call it. It starts from the point that there is no fundamental difference between living and non-living matter, right? That we call it biochemistry because it's a subset of chemistry. That is, we don't think that there is any qualitative difference. There is a difference in the way, of course, biological structures are organized. There is a difference in the way in which they can come about. That's why you need natural selection. But famously, Darwin said evolutionary biology has nothing to do with the origin of life, because the origin of life cannot be explained by natural selection. The origin of life is a biophysical process, right? And biophysicists will tell you that, whatever biological systems are, they're still physical systems. They're still chemical systems. There's no fundamental difference there. They're still thermodynamic systems that obey all the laws of physics. On the other hand, the third way seems to say that there is some kind of qualitative difference between biological organisms and everything else. And that is exactly the definition of élan vital, of this kind of sort of mysterious biological force that separates organisms from everything else. And we have rejected that idea more than a century ago.
Okay. So I think we should have closing remarks.
Sure.
Because
you think you haven't had enough yet?
yeah, I mean, I really like the way that you gave the last answer, because I guess this now brings us into the whole discussion about the overall ontology of the way that we actually look at things. I think that's a good way of looking at it. So maybe Professor Turner, you'd like to give some remarks and to close the session, and anything Massimo wants to say we can add as well.
Well, I've identified myself for several years now as a small v vitalist, in that I do think that living systems are fundamentally different from physical systems. This is not to say that living systems don't exist in the physical world, in a chemical world. There is a foundation for it. But nevertheless, I think it's begging a question to say that there's really no difference between a living system, the pine trees outside my window, and the physical world. There's certainly a physical basis for their existence, but there's something fundamentally, something that life brings fundamentally to the question that is different from purely physical systems. And so yes, I am a small v vitalist, and among the things that I think makes living systems distinct from non-living systems are these very phenomena of cognition, of purposefulness, of intentionality, and even of intelligence, even if we're stretching the definition of intelligence to incorporate this. But I do think the fundamental question you're talking about, ontology, Sabur, we start with, do we think that living systems are different in a fundamental way from physical systems? And if you're a non-vitalist, then you'll come down, I think, on Massimo's side. And if you are a small v vitalist, as I am, I think you'll come down on another side. And the whole...
Sorry, to clarify, why small v? What's the difference between a small v and a
there's
big v?
Yeah, thanks. There's big v vitalism, which is elan vital, vital spirits, those kinds of things. And small v vitalism is simply acknowledging that life is fundamentally different from non-life. And you can disagree with that, that's a perfectly legitimate point of view.
But where do you think
describe
that difference?
myself as a small v vitalist? I just said
right. No, I understand that.
Yeah,
I understand
yeah.
that. But and I find the difference interesting, but not particularly enlightening, because to use your terminology, a large V, big V vitalist says, gives an explanation. So they agree with you. Big V vitalist would agree with a small V vitalist and say, yes, life is fundamentally, qualitatively different from non-life. Great.
Yeah.
Then, of course, the obvious question is, well, a difference how? And the big V vitalist has an answer. There is a special life force, the elan vital, and that accounts for the difference. And that notion has been rejected in biology and in biophysics for over a century.
Yes, and
if I ask you the same, right? Okay, if I ask you the same question, right? Okay, so as a small v vitalist, where does that difference come from? Then what's your answer?
Well, I can give a one-word answer, and I'm going to give a shameless plug for my books here, is a proper understanding of the concept of homeostasis. That's what distinguishes life from non-life.
Okay. So what about thermostats?
Thermostats are machines, and if this is an example of the kind of cybernetic representation of homeostasis that became popular. That was popularized by Norbert Wiener and others. But if you look at the context of Claude Bernard's own thought, he regarded homeostasis as life's fundamental principle, and it certainly has a chemical basis. He was a superb experimentalist, but the basis of his thinking was that homeostasis is, the steadiness of the internal condition is the basis for a living system. And in the transition from Bernardian homeostasis to cybernetic homeostasis, we've lost that essential statement of life's unique quality. And And that's where I come down. That's where I, as a physiologist, think that we really need to take into account this phenomenon of homeostasis. And you can't have homeostasis without cognition, without intelligence, and without striving toward a particular end. So that's my answer.
Okay, brilliant. And I'd like to give a plug to Massimo's excellent book on the extended evolutionary synthesis as well. So for anybody that look further, Massimo, would you like to add anything before we end?
I think we covered quite a bit of ground. I am simply unconvinced that there is anything that dramatic or that novel. I mean, I think it's interesting that many of the ideas that Scott has brought up are either ancient or at the very least old. I mean, Colomb Bernard died in 1878. Darwin was still alive at the time. And we have a very good understanding of homeostasis in terms of mechanism. And homeostasis, of course, is the result of natural selection from a perspective of current evolutionary biology. So I don't think there is any mystery there. There is plenty of things we don't understand. There's plenty of good research that need to be done. But I am a little bit concerned about a push to revive ideas that we thought we were done with, from Aristotle to all of the other stuff that we heard so far, including vitalism, whether it is with a big V or a small v. I think the bar has to be high in terms of, as I said before, in terms of empirical evidence, especially because the claims being made are very strong. And it is a very well-established principle in epistemology that, as I said before, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I see little, if any, evidence, so we're left with just a bunch of claims.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Professor Massimo and Professor Turner, for your time, and I would love to have you back in the future, covering some of your other publications. So for everybody watching, please do read up on the two books which were referenced, and I hope you did enjoy the discussion. Good night. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thank you, Soren, and thank you, Massimo.
Thank you.